Hello, my name is Kristen Salazar. For my inquiry brief, I researched peer assessments and performance in high school literature studies. I am a teacher in a private K-12 school. My target group for this project included 25 high school students enrolled in the mainstream and honors English classes I teach. This group included 17 males and 8 females, 9 students on the autism spectrum, and 4 students who are diagnosed with dyslexia. I noticed that my students had a significant lack of participation in novel studies, meaning students were not reading the assigned pages prior to class, were unable to participate in class discussions, and regularly turned novel work in late. This lack of participation became a big issue. While I've tried different things to increase participation and student performance in the past, like student choice or different mediums, for my project this semester, I wanted to explore what factors might increase students' performance, including their preparedness, engagement in discussions, and quality of work. To examine what factors lead to improved student participation and overall performance as it relates to novel studies completed in small groups during class time, I worked to answer the question, does student performance on individual and group work differ when peer assessments within small groups are utilized? I chose to conduct a mixed method study that included several data collection tools, including surveys, formative assessments, a final summative assessment, and field notes. The students were randomly assigned to groups of 4 to 5 students reading the same novel. Those groups were then randomly assigned to complete the peer evaluation survey or complete the work without the survey component. The groups met 3 times a week for 2 weeks for a total of 6 meetings, with the experimental group meeting 1 additional time before the group sessions started for a peer evaluation training. After each small group meeting, students in the experimental group filled out a peer evaluation survey via Google Forms. The survey consisted of 2 categories, involvement and quality of work. Each of the 2 categories was broken down into specific items on a rubric. Students evaluated each person in their group on a scale of 1 weak to 5 excellent. In addition to the 5-point scale, there was also a comment section where students were required to explain their scoring. At the start of the next class, prior to meeting in groups again, students received their personal results of their peers' evaluations. All peer scores and comments were given anonymously. Students in the control group met each session but did not complete peer surveys or receive peer feedback. During these 6 group sessions, students completed individual and group tasks. First, students took a 5-question quiz about the reading content prior to meeting in groups. Then, within their groups, students completed a formative task involving a key literary skill, such as symbolism, character, or tone. That work completed during these group discussions are also what students based their peer evaluations via surveys on. At the end of the 2-week sessions, students individually completed a final summative assessment on the novel. It consisted of 30 multiple choice and short answer questions about literary elements significant to the book. My inquiry question analyzes the impact of peer assessments during small groups on student performance. The survey data and formative assessments were relevant data points for this question. I looked for changes in student performance on individual formative assessment scores and group work, as indicated from the surveys conducted after students received the initial results from their peers' first evaluation of them. Specifically, I looked for overall trends to see if peer assessments caused deviations in daily reading quiz scores, indicating that students were reading the assigned pages each day or not. I also looked to see if student performance within small groups changed, as indicated by any differences in peer assessment scores for involvement and quality of work. A change in score on the evaluations would show whether students take a more active role within their small groups because of the peer evaluation component. I also compared these scores to the control group of students that were completing the same work and meeting within groups without peer evaluations to see if these trends can be attributed to the peer evaluations alone. Before I begin my findings, it is important to note that because of a widespread virus, my experiment had significant absences. There was incomplete data points from 13 out of the 25 students. 9 of those students were a part of the control group. First, I analyzed the quiz scores. The experimental group's first quiz, prior to meeting within groups and completing peer evaluations, had an average score of 4.15 out of 5. After their initial group meeting, their average scores actually decreased to 3.77 for the next 2 quizzes, and the quiz scores rose slowly to 3.85, 3.92, and a final maximum at 4.5. The control group had lower overall scores. The average of the first quiz score was 3.22 out of 5, followed by a decrease to 2.88, an average maximum of 3.50, a dip to 3.14, slight rise to 3.20, and a final minimum in the final quiz at 2.70. What was interesting to see was that the gap between the average quiz scores of the control group and the experimental group actually decreased from quiz 1 to 3, indicating that the peer evaluations were not causing any positive effect on the quiz scores. Because the experimental group's quiz scores were always close to their average of 4.00 and the control group's quiz remained close to their average of 3.07, I do not think the quiz scores showed any real changes caused by the peer evaluations. The students first received peer evaluations prior to taking quiz 2. While there might not have been time to rectify a lack of preparation before the quiz, there definitely would have been time to make changes by quiz 3, which actually showed the least amount of difference between the two groups with an average difference of 0.27. If the evaluations had shown an impact, I believe the gap would have instead significantly increased between the two groups. Next, I looked at the scores on the summative assessments completed in group sessions. These were again graded out of a score of 5. Here, the differences were mostly minute, less than 0.16 of a difference between the two groups, slightly favoring the experimental group in the first and third session scores. During the second week, these differences increased slightly, with the control group actually scoring higher than the experimental group in sessions 4 and 6. Where you should see the most impact post-peer evaluation survey data review during session 3, there was no difference from the first session. In the second week, the average scores favored the control group twice and the experimental group once. I also looked at the final summative assessment scores. The control group scored an average of 76.17 out of 100 points, while the experimental group scored an average of 89.62. While this does show an average difference of 13.45 points between the two groups, it is worth noting that the control group's quiz scores were continually lower than the experimental group quizzes. The experimental group scored from 0.27 to 1.84 average points higher, or between 4 and 37%. I'm not exactly sure what caused the difference between the two groups, possibly the widespread absences in the control group especially, but because of this, I do not think that the summative assessment scores can be used to accurately determine any significant impact of the peer evaluations. Finally, I analyzed my field notes in conjunction with the peer survey data. I completed field notes immediately after giving the experimental group the peer evaluation survey each session. Overall, it was interesting to see how students used the rubric, or in many cases, ignored the rubric. Across the board, students would often score a peer in their group a 4 or 5 out of 5 on quality of work, but in the comments would write about how that peer had not read the required reading or was not prepared to help answer questions. Because the rubric indicated that a student who showed a complete lack of understanding of the reading should earn a 1, I was often confused at student ratings. This happened in the case of 14 out of the 58 surveys. There were also discrepancies within individual students' feedback. One peer would rate a student a 2, while another student in the group would rate that same student a 5. This happened in a total of 8 of evaluation reviews. While the students in the experimental group did receive a 30-minute training session on the rubric, the overarching feeling from my field notes combined with the survey data showed that students did not always use the rubric effectively to complete their peer evaluations. This might have had an impact on the results of the experiment.